The summer of 1989 in rural Texas felt slow and endless, the kind of season where the heat shimmered above dusty roads and the sky stretched wide and cloudless for miles. The Carter family farm sat far outside the nearest town, surrounded by open fields, tall grass, and long dirt paths that wound between old wooden fences. It was the type of place where people left their doors unlocked and neighbors knew each other by name. During the day, the sound of cicadas filled the air, and at night the darkness settled over the land so completely that the stars seemed brighter than anywhere else. For generations, the Carter farm had been a place where family gathered every summer. Cousins, uncles, and grandparents often came to visit, especially during school vacations. That year was no different. 14-year-old Ethan Carter had invited his cousins, 16-year-old Luke Ramirez and 15-year-old Daniel Ramirez, to spend the weekend with him. The three boys had grown up together, and whenever they met at the farm, it felt like their own little world, far from school, rules, and the noise of the city. The boys spent most of their days exploring the property on their dirt bikes. The farm stretched across acres of land, filled with places that felt mysterious to them. An old barn with creaking wooden doors, a rusted windmill that hadn't turned in years, and thick patches of trees where sunlight barely reached the ground. Their favorite spot was a narrow creek that ran along the edge of the property. They would sit on the muddy bank for hours, fishing with cheap rods and joking about who would catch the biggest fish. As the sun set each evening, the temperature cooled just enough for them to stay outside late into the night. They would sit on the wooden fence near the barn, talking about music, school, and the strange stories locals told about the land. Ethan once mentioned that parts of the farm had been there for nearly a century, and that his grandfather rarely talked about certain areas of the property. The boys laughed it off at the time, but the idea that the farm held old secrets only made their adventures feel more exciting. On July 14th, the day everything changed, the morning began like any other. The boys woke up early, grabbed breakfast from the kitchen, and rushed outside before the Texas heat became unbearable. Their dirt bikes roared across the fields as they raced each other along the narrow trails that cut through the property. From a distance, the sound of their engines echoed across the quiet farmland, carrying through the warm summer air as the three cousins rode farther toward the edges of the land, toward the parts of the farm they rarely visited. Fearful face ear of rice. As the afternoon heat slowly faded and the Texas sun began sinking toward the horizon, the Carter farm grew quieter than usual. Long shadows stretched across the fields, and the golden light of sunset painted the old barn and fences in a deep orange glow. It was around this time that Walter Jenkins, a 72-year-old neighbor who lived about half a mile down the dirt road, stepped out onto his porch. Walter had lived in the area his entire life, and from his porch he could often see parts of the Carter property across the open fields. Walter later told investigators that he noticed something unusual that evening. In the distance, he could see three figures walking slowly across the field near the old barn. Even from far away, he recognized the boys by their movements and the bright shirts they had been wearing earlier in the day. Instead of riding their dirt bikes like they normally did, they were walking side by side, heading toward the far end of the property, an area most people on the farm rarely visited. That part of the land had always felt a little forgotten. The grass there grew taller than anywhere else on the property, and rusted farm equipment had been left behind decades earlier. Near the edge of the field stood an old metal tank, half sunken into the ground and surrounded by weeds. Not far from it was a broken windmill and the remains of an abandoned well. Walter remembered thinking it was strange that the boys were heading in that direction just as the sun was about to disappear. A little while later, as darkness began to settle over the fields, Walter was inside his house preparing dinner when he suddenly heard a loud metallic sound echo across the quiet farmland. It was sharp and heavy, like two large pieces of metal slamming together. The sound carried through the evening air and then quickly faded, leaving the countryside silent again. Walter paused for a moment, listening, but when he didn't hear anything else, he assumed it was just old equipment shifting in the wind. The next morning, when deputies knocked on his door asking if he had seen the three cousins, that strange moment from the evening before suddenly returned to his mind with unsettling clarity. Walter described the boys walking toward the far end of the property and mentioned the loud metallic noise he had heard after sunset. At the time, no one knew exactly what it meant, but the detail would stay in investigators' notes for decades, an eerie memory of the last known moment anyone had seen the three cousins alive. Sunrise fearful face. The morning after the boys disappeared, the peaceful Carter farm was suddenly filled with panic. When Ethan's grandfather realized the cousins had never returned home the night before, he assumed they had simply stayed out too late exploring the fields. But when the sun rose and their beds were still empty, worry quickly turned into fear. Their dirt bikes were discovered lying on their sides near the old barn, exactly where the boys had last been seen riding. The engines were cold by then, but the sight of the abandoned bikes sent a chill through everyone on the property. Within hours, the local sheriff's department arrived and began organizing a search across the farmland. Deputies spread out in teams, walking through tall grass and checking every structure on the property. Volunteers from nearby towns soon joined the effort, forming long lines as they moved slowly across the fields, scanning the ground for footprints, dropped items, or any sign of where the cousins might have gone. Helicopters circled overhead, their blades chopping through the hot Texas air as they searched from above. Tracking dogs were brought in later that afternoon. The handlers gave the dogs pieces of clothing that belonged to the boys, hoping the scent would lead them somewhere useful. For a moment, it seemed promising. The dogs picked up a trail that led directly from the barn toward the far end of the property. Search teams followed closely behind, pushing through thick weeds and dry brush. But after several hundred yards, the scent suddenly stopped near an overgrown patch of land filled with rusted farm equipment. Investigators expanded the search even further over the next several days. They checked the nearby creek, dragging sections of the water and searching along the muddy banks. Old wells were inspected, barns were opened, and every abandoned structure within miles was carefully examined. Deputies even went door to door in nearby communities, asking residents if they had seen a strange vehicle or anyone suspicious passing through the area that night. But despite the massive effort, there was nothing. No footprints leading away from the property, no sign of a struggle, and no evidence that the boys had been taken by force. Their trail seemed to vanish right there on the Carter farm, leaving investigators with more questions than answers. As days turned into weeks, the once busy search site slowly grew quiet again. But the mystery of how 3 teenage cousins could disappear from an open field without leaving a trace continued to haunt everyone involved in the case. Fearful face helicopter #. As weeks turned into months, the search for Ethan, Luke, and Daniel slowly faded from the headlines. But in the small Texas community surrounding the Carter farm, the mystery never truly disappeared. People in town continued to talk about the case in quiet conversations at grocery stores, gas stations, and diners along the highway. Everyone had their own theory about what might have happened to the 3 cousins that summer night in 1989. Some believed the boys had simply run away. Teenagers sometimes made impulsive decisions, and investigators briefly considered the possibility that the cousins had left town together without telling anyone. But that theory quickly began to fall apart. None of the boys had taken money, clothes, or personal belongings with them. Their families insisted they had shown no signs of wanting to leave home. To many people in town, the idea that all 3 would suddenly run away together without any preparation seemed almost impossible. Other rumors were darker. A few locals whispered about a mysterious pickup truck that had supposedly been seen driving slowly along the dirt road near the farm that same evening. Some believed a stranger passing through the area might have abducted the boys. Deputies investigated the tip, questioning travelers and checking nearby towns, but nothing concrete ever came from the lead. The truck was never identified, and no witnesses could provide a clear description of the driver. Then there were the stories about the farm itself. Older residents claimed parts of the Carter property had always felt strange, especially the far end of the land where old equipment and structures had been left behind for decades. A few neighbors even claimed they occasionally heard unusual sounds drifting across the fields late at night, metal clanging, faint echoes, or movements near the abandoned barn long after the Carter family had stopped living there regularly. Over the years, the farm slowly fell into silence. The family eventually moved away, unable to stay on land that carried such painful memories. Without anyone maintaining it, the once busy property became overgrown with weeds and tall grass. The barn aged and sagged, fences collapsed, and rusted farm machinery remained where it had been left decades earlier. Yet the story of the missing cousins never faded from the town's memory, lingering like a shadow over the empty fields where the boys had last been seen. Eerie fearful face. For more than 3 decades, the Carter farm remained almost completely untouched. After the family moved away, the land sat quiet and forgotten on the outskirts of the county. The wooden fences slowly collapsed, tall grass swallowed the dirt paths, and the once busy barn stood alone in the middle of the property, its paint peeling under years of sun and rain. People in the nearby town rarely came near the place anymore. To many locals, the farm had become a reminder of the mystery that had never been solved. Over time, the land grew wild. Thick weeds and thorny bushes spread across the fields, hiding old pieces of rusted equipment that had been left behind decades earlier. The dirt trails where the boys once rode their bikes were no longer visible, and the barn doors creaked loudly whenever the wind pushed against them. Travelers passing along the nearby road could barely see the farmhouse anymore, as trees and overgrown plants had slowly taken over the property. In early 2024, the quiet status of the farm finally changed. A small construction company from a nearby city purchased the land with plans to clear it and build a new residential development. The company saw the property as a perfect location, wide open land with enough space for several homes. For the first time in decades, heavy machinery began arriving at the old Carter farm. Bulldozers rolled across the fields, flattening tall grass and clearing away thick patches of brush that had grown undisturbed for years. Workers began removing broken fences, hauling away rusted farm tools, and tearing down structures that had become too unstable to stand. The old barn, which had once been the center of the property, was carefully dismantled piece by piece. As the days passed, the land slowly started to look different, as if the past buried within it was being uncovered layer by layer. One afternoon, while clearing a dense patch of weeds near the far end of the property, the same area that had always been the most forgotten part of the farm, a construction worker noticed something unusual sticking out of the dirt. At first, it looked like a curved piece of metal barely visible beneath the soil. Curious, he called a few other workers over, and together they began brushing away the dirt and tangled roots surrounding it. As more of the object became visible, they realized it wasn't just a random piece of scrap metal. It was part of a large cylindrical tank that appeared to have been deliberately buried underground many years earlier. Fearful face hole #. At first glance, the object looked like nothing more than an old storage tank that had been forgotten beneath decades of dirt and weeds. Rust covered most of its surface, and patches of hardened soil clung to the metal like it had been part of the ground for years. The workers assumed it was probably an old fuel or water tank left behind from the farm's earlier days. Still, something about the way it was positioned seemed unusual. Instead of being placed above ground like most farm tanks, this one appeared to have been deliberately buried deep beneath the soil. Curious, the crew brought over a small excavator and carefully began digging around the edges of the metal cylinder. As the machine pulled away layers of dirt, more of the tank slowly emerged. It was much larger than they had first thought, nearly 10 feet long and wide enough that two people could barely reach across it. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became that someone had intentionally placed the tank underground and then covered it carefully with soil and debris. When the tank was finally almost fully exposed, one of the workers noticed something that made everyone pause. At the top of the cylinder was a thick circular lid made of heavy steel. What made it strange was that the edges of the lid looked uneven and sealed with old welding marks, as if someone had deliberately closed it permanently. Tanks like these usually had removable caps or bolts, but this one appeared to have been completely welded shut from the outside. The workers exchanged uneasy looks. None of them remembered seeing anything like it on other farms they had cleared before. One of them suggested that instead of trying to open it themselves, they should contact the local authorities. Within an hour, deputies from the county sheriff's department arrived at the site. Some of the older officers immediately recognized the significance of where the tank had been found, only a short distance from the area where the three cousins had last been seen back in 1989. Investigators carefully inspected the metal surface before deciding to cut through the old welds. As a cutting tool sliced through the rusted steel, sparks scattered across the dusty ground. Slowly, the heavy lid began to loosen. When deputies finally pried it open, a rush of stale, trapped air escaped from inside the tank, carrying with it a smell that had been sealed away for decades. The officers leaned forward cautiously, shining flashlights into the darkness inside the cylinder, their expressions changing almost instantly as they realized what they were looking at. As the beam of the flashlights cut through the darkness inside the tank, the officers immediately realized this was not just an old piece of farm equipment. The narrow space inside was filled with objects that had clearly been sealed away for decades. Dust clung to everything, and the air inside felt heavy and stale after being trapped underground for so long. One deputy carefully leaned closer, trying to identify what they were seeing among the rusted metal and debris. The first items investigators noticed were pieces of clothing tangled together near the bottom of the tank. Though time had faded the colors and damaged the fabric, certain details still stood out. A worn sneaker, a belt buckle, and the faded remains of a t-shirt were slowly lifted out and placed carefully on the ground beside the tank. Even before forensic teams arrived, some of the older officers at the scene exchanged uneasy glances, realizing these items looked eerily similar to the clothes described in the missing persons reports from 1989. As the tank was examined more carefully, deputies discovered more personal belongings scattered inside. A rusted bicycle chain lay twisted near the side, along with what appeared to be the broken frame of a pair of glasses. A small metal keychain was also found, barely recognizable beneath layers of rust and dirt. But once it was cleaned slightly, the shape became clear. It carried the faded emblem of a Texas high school football team, the same school Ethan Carter had attended before he disappeared. News of the discovery spread quickly through the sheriff's department. Within hours, the old case files from 1989 were pulled from storage and brought back into the investigation room. Detectives began comparing the newly discovered items with the original reports, photographs, and witness statements from decades earlier. Piece by piece, the evidence began to align with the long-unsolved mystery of the three cousins who had vanished from the Carter farm. As the sun slowly set over the fields once again, investigators stood around the open tank, realizing they might finally be looking at the place where the trail had ended all those years ago. For 35 years, the truth had remained hidden just beneath the surface of the land, buried in silence while the world moved on above it. And as the deputies continued examining the items recovered from inside the tank, one unsettling thought lingered in the air. Someone had placed that tank there, sealed it shut, and buried it carefully, making sure that whatever was inside would stay hidden for as long as possible. The discovery of the buried tank reopened wounds that the small Texas community had carried for 35 long years. Families who had spent decades wondering what truly happened to Ethan, Luke, and Daniel finally had the painful confirmation they had feared all along. The boys had never left the Carter farm. The truth had been lying just beneath the soil the entire time, hidden in silence while seasons passed and memories slowly faded. Investigators continued piecing together the evidence, hoping to understand how the cousins ended up inside that sealed tank and who might have been responsible. Old witness statements were revisited, forgotten details were re-examined, and detectives searched for answers buried deep in the past. But one thing was already certain. This discovery had transformed a cold case into a chilling reminder that some secrets can remain hidden for decades before the truth finally comes to light. Today, the empty fields of the old Carter farm look different than they did in 1989, but the story of those three cousins still echoes through the land. For the families, the pain of loss will never fully disappear, yet the truth, no matter how dark, can sometimes bring a small measure of closure. And perhaps the most haunting part of this mystery is the realization that for 35 years, the answer was there all along, buried beneath the quiet Texas soil, waiting for someone to finally uncover it.
If you liked this video, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Most importantly, subscribe and hit the bell icon so the next secret finds you first.